function in lending money, or lending receipts, I should say. Receipts are claims on gold, and of course they lent more than they had gold. More receipts got in circulation. Whether the people panicked and tried to get their gold back, or whether the goldsmith simply absconded with what gold he had and left them holding worthless receipts, I want you to remember as we go through this that these were receipts 100% redeemable in gold. They were redeemable in gold according to the words on them. And today we have a lot of men giving us financial advice in newsletters and so on who imply that if we could just go back to receipts redeemable in gold, we would solve all our economic problems. Now, there was another facet of this that I mentioned just in passing, which is really the major part of this. I mentioned that the man borrowing the gold and taking just the receipt for it was required by the goldsmith to pay usury. He had to pay something more than the principal or the face amount of the receipt which he received. So as a result, that even if the goldsmith stayed in business, even if he did redeem in gold all the notes that came in to him, the usury was added to the debt, and the receipts in circulation were always less than the total amount owed. So not only gold, but eventually, when those who could not get even the gold or the receipts to pay back to the goldsmith had to give up their land, ships, buildings, and other real wealth, went to the goldsmith in payment. The result being that the goldsmith continued then not only to get gold in his vault and mortgages, but he took ownership or title to lands and properties. And in something less than 100 to 200 years, the local goldsmith would become the owner of a good share of the land and real wealth of whatever neighborhood he was functioning in. Now we're going to compare this to the U.S. banking system. As Pastor Williams pointed out, when you go into a bank to get a loan, the man does not give you money. He doesn't give you gold. He doesn't give you even Federal Reserve notes or U.S. notes. He gives you a claim on money. Remember, this is what the goldsmith gave, was a claim on gold. You get a claim on money. He gives it to you in the form of a check or a deposit receipt that says you have X number of dollars in your checking account. In return for that, you give him a claim on your earnings plus a claim on your property, so he can have your property if you can't pay. That's what the goldsmith did. That's what the banker does. Now the question, which I've already given you the answer for, is, did the goldsmith give actual gold? No, he did not. Does the banker give actual money? No, he does not. He gives you a claim on money. And if you will look at his check or your deposit receipt, it is not money, it is a claim on money. It says, I promise to pay to, or pay to, and it gives the person's name to who it's to be paid. So what the bank does under the modern money system, you have given him a claim on your property or your future earnings. He puts your IOU in his safe, just like the goldsmith put your mortgage or your IOU in his safe. You put his IOU in circulation as money, just like the goldsmith's receipts went in circulation as money. However, you pay him interest on his IOU. He pays you nothing on your IOU. Now, do most of you understand what you've done? When you go to a bank to borrow money, you exchange promises to pay. He promises to pay, but he doesn't pay. He just gives you a promise to pay. You, in turn, write other promises to pay called checks, which are not paid either in money. They simply they circulate as promises to pay. However, his promise to pay, which is backed by your house, your farm, your business, your automobile, or whatever, his promise to pay becomes money. But your promise to pay becomes debt. You must then, because of the usury, pay back to him more than you received from him in other promises to pay or in wealth. And because of this usury, his promise to pay or his claim or receipt which he gives to you in circulation is always less. Totally, they are always less than the amount owed to the banker. Remember, I said that with the goldsmith, as long as the usury was added, the number of receipts or claims in gold, the total amount, was always less than the total owed to the goldsmith because of the usury. The same thing is true of the modern banking system. The amount in circulation is always less than the amount owed to the banker. So eventually, not only gold, but land, ships, buildings, and so forth go to the banker in payment, and in 100 to 200 years, like the goldsmith in medieval Europe, he owns most of the land and wealth in the area, community, or nation in which he does business. Here is a picture that we have used. You'll recognize this as from my booklet, Billions for the Bankers. It shows how the loans going into circulation, money or checks, would constitute a certain amount, but they would carry on them a claim for usury, a promise to pay usury more than the amount. The result is that the people work, exchange all of these promises to pay among themselves. They do serve as a medium of exchange. That's important to remember. These promises to pay do serve as money. They do facilitate the exchange of goods and services, and the people work, produce, buy, sell, and exist. However, since there is never enough here to pay both the principal and the interest, eventually some of these people lose their homes, their farms, and their business, and they go where? Back to the man who has the claim on the usury. Back to the banker. Today he's called a banker. He's not called a goldsmith. The result was shown recently in a U.S. News and World Report issue of May 21st, 1984. I'll show the front cover here in case you might recognize it or have it at home. And then inside they put a drawing. And I hope this shows up on the video cameras. And you'll see that the first roll of money here, it says who owes what. In 1974, the first small one is 1974. The second is 1984. And I'll the first one is debts of government. The next is debts of people. The next is debts of business. I'm not sure that green is going to show up, but I think the audience can see that from 1974 to 1984, the debts of these segments of our society doubled and tripled. Why did they double and triple? They doubled and tripled because the usury, as Pastor William showed in his pool of money, the usury took the money out of circulation faster than the money was coming in. So each one of these entities, the government, the individual people, and the business, had to borrow more and more to keep money in circulation. So right here before the eyes of millions of people is a graph showing the utter impossibility of the continuance of this system. The only thing they don't show, and they almost never show, is the movement of real wealth, land, property, and buildings into the hands of the money lenders. They list in here the debts per person. 1974, $10,000. 1984, $26,000. The debts are a share of total output. In 1974, the debt was 164% of total output. 1984, 189%. And then they have another bar graph showing the interest payments as a share of the national income. The interest payments in 1974 were 5.5%. In 1984, they were 9.3%. So of everything that we produce, 10% of that is taken every year by the money lenders. And remember, when I say money lenders, we're talking about a comparatively small number of people. It is probable that the families who live on money lending might constitute less than 100,000 families. We have close to 100 million families in America. and about 100,000 would take this land, property, and usury, and that's why, of course, they are getting ownership of the property. This is a quote from a book written by a man by name Kitson some years ago, and he says, "The economic and political supremacy of this class," referring to the lending class, "depends upon maintaining a worldwide scarcity of legal tender in order that there shall exist a perpetual market for their credit." Now, when he uses the term credit here, he's referring to these promises to pay. That's what you receive when you make this loan, or you ask for this loan from the money lender. You get what he calls credit. And in fact, he'll tell you, "I can't lend this to you because your credit isn't any good." You see, it's your credit he lends to you, not his. Doesn't make any difference what his credit is. Your credit is what he lends to you, so you borrow this credit, the interest upon which is their chief source of income. Pastor Williams showed this, and I want to remind you that as long as they have the money in the vault, the gold in the vault, the credit in the vault, whatever it is that passes as a security for loans, or whatever passes as a medium of exchange, if it's in their vault, they're not gaining wealth from it. They gain wealth from it only by lending it to you, to the productive segment of the society, who then pay interest. Usury. If you paid back to the bank only the amount he lent you, there would be no gain. Now, I hope that with the little that we've shown, you can see that these so-called money experts, of which there are several hundred in the United States publishing monthly newsletters, who are telling you that we can solve all of our economic problems if we only have paper money redeemable in gold. Europe went through 2,000 years with paper money redeemable in gold. And it was good only until somebody absconded with the gold, and then the whole society collapsed. Here is what we have in America today. This is our money system. We have a family plan. This is the Gormley Loan Company. We have a family plan where your descendants pay off our descendants. This was in the Saturday Evening Post in November of 1982, and there in that one picture is the entire methodology of the robbery and plunder of a large portion of the American populace by a small portion using money. Now, I'm going to go on for just a few minutes to show you something that I think is going to happen in the not-too-distant future. Remember, I told you that in some cases in Europe, the moneylender, after getting as much as he could out of the people, and the people being frightened, or through some war, a revolution, or overthrow, assassination of the king, or whatever, became frightened and began to turn in their receipts for the real gold. The moneylender would, or the goldsmith would load his gold on carriages or ships, and he would leave. Now, there's another facet that I didn't explain in the previous one, which I'm going to tell you how goldsmiths, moneylenders, bankers, whatever you want to call them, can, over a very short period of time, gain a claim on all the property of the nation. In the lending to you and getting your interest, it takes several generations to get all of your property. There's another way they can do it in a short period of time. It was done in Germany in the early 1920s. It is already underway in America, and you may have seen the evidence in your newspaper and magazines. I'm going to show you a few things. I'm not sure you can read this. This is from February of 1983. A Knoxville bank goes under. This Knoxville bank apparently went broke, and the people from the government moved in and closed the doors, reorganized it, and it was actually taken over by other banks. It says, Tennessee banking magnate Jake Butcher used to boast that he rose from rural poverty to wealth and political influence the honest way by borrowing money. trouble was, as chief executive of the 5 banks in his United American Group, Butcher liked to lend money to, and too freely. Among the favored borrowers, Democratic politicians and the bank's directors and their relatives. Then they go on to show that the bank supposedly collapsed after their loans far exceeded their ability or their assets. They lent out so much money, and the lenders were not able to, or the borrowers were not able to pay it back. Remember how I explained the goldsmith lending out money far in excess of the gold that he had? Well, the modern banking system allows that also. Generally, for the last 70 years, they have been lending that money to the producing part of society. Now they are beginning to lend it in large volume to what? Politicians, bank directors, and relatives. Now here's another portion of that same, or another article about that same man. Last week, his success story took a nasty turn. Citing unusually large loan losses, Tennessee banking authorities abruptly closed down his United American Bank, the city's largest and most free-willing financial institution. It was the 3rd biggest commercial bank failure in the U.S., and then they go on later to say something about him. They say he's one nice guy, said his neighbor, Marion Sheldon. Trouble is, he's been too nice to his debtors. Now, what did we read in the previous article as to who his debtors were? Relatives. Relatives. The man supposedly now has lost the value of the bank stock. But he lent, and here's a little bit of the information. According to the FDIC, spokesman Alan Whitley, the FDIC had been concerned about the UAB. We're talking about the same bank, and this is only one of many. As long ago as 1979, because of the higher rate than normal of loans labeled as lost, substandard, or doubtful. After warning the bank, the FDIC last fall took the extraordinary step of assigning no fewer than 150 examiners to UAB and 4 sister banks, owned by Butcher, as well as to 6 others owned by his brother. One major problem was the unusually large number of insider loans to directors, officers, relatives, and friends of UAB directors and stockholders, including brother C.H. At one time, the bank carried $515,000 in unsecured loans to former Carter administrator official Bert Lance. Now, the producing part of America cannot go to a bank and borrow $500,000 on an unsecured loan, but they're lending this to friends and relatives. As of December 31st, 1982, insider, that means loans to directors, relatives, and friends, totaled $55 million at a time when the FDIC was warning that the bank was in a critical liquidity situation. All right, these people have, because of their so-called insider loans, have caused this bank to close. Here's another headline on another bank, not this same one. Insiders blamed for 61% of the commercial bank failures. That means that at this point in time, about 2/3 of the banks that are closing are not closing because of their lending to farmers and businessmen and you people. They're closing because they are making multi-million-dollar loans to insiders. And here's the key paragraph in that same article. In a letter to the panel last week, Jesse Snyder, Assistant Director of the Bank Supervision for the FDIC, said it can be safely concluded that insider criminal misconduct was a major cause of recent bank failures. He added, this is not a new development unique to this period. In a study of 67 bank failures between 1960 to 74, Snyder said the insurance corporation found 31% of the failures were caused by misappropriation, embezzlement, or manipulation. In an additional 53% of the cases, he wrote, self-serving loans to bank management or friends of management were blamed for the failures. And the thing that they do not emphasize, which I want to emphasize, is they make these loans to their friends and their relatives, multi-million-dollar loans, and then they write them off as uncollectible. In other words, the friend, the relative, and the politician does not have to pay the loan back. He has $1 million, $10 million, $50 million, $100 million, $500 million, whatever they want to loan him, because why? Well, because they can write loans to anyone at any time. As Pastor William showed you in one of his cartoons, they have a pen. And that's all they need to create that loan. They will give a deposit receipt to a friend or a relative for $100 million. That friend or that relative does not have to wait to earn or obtain $100 million on usury. He has it that day. In Germany in 1921 and 22, the bankers in Germany did the same thing. Instead of waiting to collect the nation through usury, they created deposit receipts and checks for their friends and their relatives, and they lent them millions, then billions, and then trillions of marks, and they went out and bought Germany. That process is underway in America. And it's very interesting that most of the financial news writers who have been calling for gold are now beginning to warn us how terrible it is that banks might fail. And the implication is that the bank failure somehow or other will make the bank owner a pauper. No, I beg to differ with you. In the process of causing his own bank to fail, he will write money to his friends, his relatives, his wife, his children, his cousin, his aunt and uncle in amounts possibly 10 to 100 times the value of his bank. It goes in circulation, and you people accept it as money because you've been accepting it for 75 years, have you not? Checks and Federal Reserve notes. And so I am estimating that sometime in the next few years, and I should say I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, but I believe in the next few years, as they perfect this methodology, that we're going to find a vast operation of the creation of loans to the families of the people who own the banking system. And they won't sit and wait another 2 or 3 generations to take ownership of all the nation. They will buy it from you with checks, deposit receipts, and this so-called M1 in the banking system. And as they do it, you will be glad to sell your home for $100,000 when it's only worth $50,000, or your business for $20 million when it's only worth $2 million, because you want the money. They did this in Germany. The German people sold their farms for 2 and 3 times their current value. And as this vast sum of money, whether it's checkbook, credit, or even if it's claims on gold, no matter what it is, as it goes in circulation in this massive amount, which they will do as they put it in circulation through friends and relatives, it will depreciate in value. From 1921 to 1923 in Germany, the mark went from the equivalent of $1 for 1 mark to 1 trillion marks to buy 1 American dollar. I have a letter in my file from a banker to a lady after they reorganized the banking system in 1923, after the relatives of all of the Jewish bankers had purchased most of the farms, most of the apartment buildings, most of the income-producing property, most of the timberland, and actually taken title of it. They reorganized it, and they told the people to bring in their money and or their former deposits in banks, and they would convert them to the new mark. And the new mark was issued on the basis of 1 trillion to 1. I have a letter in my file from a banker to a lady who had several 100,000 marks in her previous account of the old marks. And he wrote and told her that the amount she would get now would be about 67 pennies, and he wondered whether she would rather just simply come in and get the pennies rather than open an account, as it would cost them more to open an account than the 67 pennies. So you see, there is a methodology by which they can take the present system and not just wait for the foreclosures, but to begin a process where they can buy over a short period of 6 months to a year and a half. They did it in Germany in 1.5 years. For the purpose of closing, I'm going to have to ask for about how much time that I have left. 13 minutes? All right, thank you. I have another 1.5 hour lecture here in front of me, which I'll run through in about 15 minutes. Pastor Williams began with the statement, as he went through his presentation, that usury was the problem. That is the current problem. We've allowed a system of usury to be fastened upon us. This is from the book, The Church in Usury, in the introduction. Mr. Leckie correctly represents the traditional notions of usury when he says, according to the unanimous teaching of the old theologians, usury consisted of any interest that was exacted by the lender from the borrower solely as the price of the loan. Its nature was therefore entirely independent of the amount that was asked and of the civil laws upon the subject. Those who lent money at 3% were committing usury quite as really as those who lent it at 40%. And those who lent money at interest in a country where there was no law upon the subject as those who lent it in defiance of the most stringent prohibitions. In other words, they were committing the sin of usury whether or not the amount was low or high, and whether or not there was a law against it. Catholic theologians, adopting the view that usury is unjust, have spent much labor in trying to determine what exactly are these grounds. Some have said that God, being the absolute owner of all earthly possessions, can, for his own ends, transfer the goods of one person to another, and this he has done with regard to usury. Now, you know, some of our modern theologians use the same idea. Well, God allows it, so therefore it must be all right. And there isn't one minister in the pulpits of America today out of 10,000 who preach against usury. This explanation is certainly adequate, but it seems rather forced. Moreover, one might object that God is thus made to sanction the spoliation of the Gentiles, so that the Jews might enrich themselves by robbery if they so desired. For if usury is unjust, its legislation is equivalent to a removal of the obligation of observing the requirements of justice. St. Ambrose would have had no difficulty in adopting such extreme measures toward the Gentiles. Who was the stranger, he asked, but Amalek, but an enemy? Take usury from him whose life you may take without sin. The right of waging war implies the right of taking usury. St. Ambrose, I believe, correctly stated this, that you can take usury only from a person that you might wage war against. In other words, only your deadly enemy. And of course, he equates in that basis usury with warfare, usury with killing, as did Martin Luther. I want to read this. This is in the book, to show you what happened in an ancient civilization because of usury. We have practically no information concerning the state of Attica anterior to the time of Solon, except such as may derive from an examination of the legislation of Solon himself. Now, Solon was the man the Greeks chose to bring themselves out of this terrible time of pillage and plunder, and he set the system aright. But here was the Grecian situation under usury prior to Solon. Misery seems to have been written across the face of the land. A twofold system of credit prevailed. Money might, on the one hand, be borrowed on the security of the property of the debtor. with a bad system of land tenure and with exorbitant rates of interest, there was scarcely a peasant who had not been forced to mortgage his property in security for debts necessarily incurred. Pillar stones were set up on each farm to mark the names of the various creditors and the extent of their claims on the land, a system of account-keeping which was utterly detested by the people. Money might be borrowed, too, on personal security, and this system was even worse than the other. It was simply a law of bankruptcy based on slavery. The debtor might sell into slavery his younger sisters, his unmarried daughters, or his sons, if minors, in order to meet his liabilities. And if these were not sufficient for the purpose, the debtor himself might be sold into slavery. Many free men of Attica thus passed into the hands of masters who either worked them cruelly at home or sold them for shipment to foreign lands. Then he gives a system in Rome under the same kind of a system, under a usury system. In Rome, the laws which dealt with debt were to a late period even more severe than those of Attica before Solon's time. The primitive Roman law distinguished between loan contracts and other contracts such as sale, through which the debt might be incurred, and in the former instances gave the creditor full power over the person of the debtor. Remember, one of the things that we supposedly abolished in America was the debtor prison. We still do not allow you to go to jail for debt. They did. They gave them full power over the person of the debtor. Aulus Gellius gives the mode of procedure as fixed by the law of the 12 tables, 450 B.C. If the debtor admitted the debt, or if it were proved in court, he was allowed 30 days for payment. If he failed to pay before the expiration of that period, the creditor might seize upon him. This was known as manus injectio, and having secured the sentence of the praetor, might expose him thrice in the marketplace to see if any person should pay the debt through compassion. They had a system where these people were taken up. They put a sign on them on the amount that was owed. Some person might simply pay the debt to relieve this person. If the debt were not paid within 60 days, a sentence of eviction was pronounced. Then he might be sold as a slave or put to death at the will of the creditor. Or if the latter so desired, he might be made to pay off the debt with the labor of his own hands. He could become a slave to the creditor for the rest of his life. Now let me ask you, are our laws any different than that? Our laws recognize our unpayable debts through the government, through the federal government, through state governments, through cities, through counties, through various bureaucracies that they have set up, and our children and our children and our children's children will be forced by law to pay those debts. Am I describing in America a system any different than this horrible system that evolved in ancient Greece and ancient Rome? And if there were several creditors and each secured a sentence of eviction, in other words, possession of the body, then his body might be divided and the parts distributed amongst them, though Gellius does not know of any instance in which this was done. In other words, usury on money brought about the destruction of these ancient empires through the placing of people in personal slavery or even being put to death because of one thing: usury, an increase on money. And I read quite a few of these financial newsletters, and I've been warning Christian people of the financial newsletters from Howard Ruff on down. They all rail against paper money as if it were the problem. None of them, and that's literally true except possibly Richard Hoskins out in Virginia, none of them explain, preach against, or rail against usury. And usury or increase is the problem. Remember what I said a while ago. No matter if the banker did create the money and lent it to you, if you paid back only the principal, he would have no gain. He would have no claim on your property. He would not take your property because there would be enough money in circulation to pay the principal on all loans. But with the addition of usury, it is a mathematical impossibility to pay back the loans that our people have. We are in debt and only God Almighty can bring us out of it. Thank God He's promised us. Here are just a few more of these things. Plato objects to usury or interest on the ground that it is destructive of that equality of states which is necessary for the avoidance of sedition, for it would set the poor and impoverished against the moneyed class. We saw that with the gold moneylender. If he reached a point where the people realized he couldn't pay the money back, they might even revolt against him and kill him. So he sometimes had to flee for his life. Indeed, Plato would go so far as to make it unlawful for the borrower to repay either principal or interest to the lender if he charged usury. The profession of the usurer he considers despicable, for it is simply an illiberal method of making money, of money making, and has in consequence a debasing effect. And then he gives some of these other things. This one I don't have fully on there. I guess I missed the bottom. But at the very bottom, he applied it to the breeding of money, because the offspring resembles the parent, wherefore of all modes of money-making, this is the most unnatural. He used the term unnatural in relation to the charging of interest on money. I would suggest that anyone who wants to understand the biblical or Christian background on usury should read the book, The Church and Usury. And I think I won't show any more of those right now. I believe that we have shown you enough to prove that the present system of money and economics in America is for practical purposes identical to that of the goldsmiths in medieval Europe. They simply imply that they have something back in their vaults, or they have some authority, or they have something which you think is valuable that makes that claim on it worth your exchange for goods and services. They have created a fictitious value for their checkbook, for their check, or for their deposit, and because of custom and usage, we accept that in payment of goods and services, and it does work. The fact that he had the gold back there supposedly created in their minds the value of the article. But as we have already seen, he didn't necessarily have enough gold, and in some cases, he simply left with his gold. If we were to have gold back money in America, and that gold were to be deposited in some vault in the ground in New York, or someplace in Washington, D.C., if an enemy seized the gold, or if an enemy seized that part of the country, what would happen to our gold back money? The same thing that happened under the money lender. It would become worthless. But even in the time period when it was good, when it was accepted, as the present money is accepted, what was it doing? It was drawing through usury, through interest, the wealth and the goods and the production of the people into the hands of the moneylender. The process is inevitable. The moneylender that charges usury will eventually own and control the people and the nation in which he operates. There is no other end to that kind of a system. Now, I hope and pray that we've given you enough of a glimpse of the modern system to know it's not a modern system. It's an ancient system of plunder. And I do pray that each of you will then turn and read God's holy word, where God explains the condemnation on usury, because usury is theft. Usury, according to Luther, was the same as murder, because you took the sustenance or the ability of the person to sustain the life of himself and his family. And only God's word has an answer in his law, and then in his prophets, and of course in the covenant he has made to his people, that he will deliver us out of this ungodly system, this ancient Babylonian system of gold and usury that has been fastened upon us. So you pray for America, you pray for our other Israelite nations, that the day will soon come when these things will be brought to pass, that God has promised in his word, that will take us from our captivity, not a captivity under alien soldiers, but a captivity of debt and bondage under a system of debt and usury. The day is soon upon us, and God will deliver us according to Jesus.